Hello and welcome to this basics episode on Locomotion, the only railway locomotive to inspire a dance craze over a century after it first steamed, and the first locomotive to work a passenger train on a public railway. Locomotion was built for the Stockton and Darlington Railway by Robert Stephenson Co of Newcastle. The origins of the Stockton and Darlington go back to a proposed 18th century canal, but the idea of a railway only really took off in 1818, thanks to patronage by the Pease family of wealthy Quakers of Darlington. An Act of Parliament was obtained in 1821, and the line was engineered by the foremost railway and locomotive engineer of his day, George Stephenson. The line opened 4 years later, in September 1825. Robert Stephenson Co had been established in 1823, again thanks to the wealthy Pease family, but trouble lay in store for the young company. In 1824, Robert Stephenson, the managing director, broke from his father and travelled to South America, lured by promises of great wealth in the silver mines. So he was absent from the works. So too George Stephenson, who had moved to Liverpool to work on his new project, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. This left only Michael Longridge of the Bedlington Iron Works as the only director capable of any technical and managerial input. But his first interest lay in his own company, which was 15 miles away in Morpeth. It's not surprising then that the firm got into trouble both financially and technically at this very crucial time. In order to tie things over, two new faces were brought in, Timothy Hackworth and James Kennedy. They were brought in to provide much-needed technical expertise. Hackworth had been foreman smith at Wylam Colliery and late at Walbottle Colliery. Kennedy was a Scottish millwright and marine engineer who was employed at Stephenson's for 18 months, during the crucial period when the 4 locomotives for the Stockton and Darlington were being built. Locomotion was the first of the 4. It was a simple 4-wheeler with an egg-ended wrought iron boiler containing a single straight flue. There were 2 vertical cylinders, part immersed in the boiler, but whereas earlier Stephenson locomotives had used a much simpler crosshead arrangement to guide the piston rod, Locomotion was delivered with William Fremantle's complicated grasshopper motion, probably inspired by the work's stationary engine. And indeed there are several drawings, including notes by George Stephenson, trying to work out the valve gear of these engines. Before the advent of suitably strong steel for making springs, early locomotives had either lacked suspension completely, or had used the patent steam springs of George Stephenson. This was a very canny idea-like, which used a cylinder and piston open to the boiler at one end, so that the boiler pressure could act as a sort of shock absorber. Sadly, on the boiler pressure of the day, they didn't work. So with Locomotion, instead a 3-point suspension was used. The leading axle was fixed, whilst the trailing axle was carried in what's called a cannon box. The axle ran in a tube which was pivoted at its centre point, so it was capable of rocking to impart a crude form of suspension. But this presented 2 problems. Hitherto, locomotive wheels had been coupled by gears or chains, but having a rocking axle meant that neither could be used. So, at the suggestion of James Kennedy, outside coupling rods and fly cranks were used instead, the crank pins themselves being spherical to account for the action of the rocking axle. The other problem was that of the valve gear. It was usual to use 2 eccentrics, 1 per cylinder mounted on each axle, but again the rocking axle precluded this. So instead there is a single eccentric on the leading axle to provide movement for the valves of both cylinders. Suffice to say the timing of the valve of the rear cylinder is a little lumpy. The wheels were cast iron with 8 spokes, but they were very brittle and often broke, so they were replaced by 2-part cast iron plug wheels invented by Robert Wilson of Gateshead in 1827. The present set of wheels on the engine are mismatched and probably result from the 1856 restoration. Yet, despite all the problems at Robert Stephenson Co whilst Locomotion was being built, and despite the undoubtedly rough manufacture, she was completed and first steamed in the middle of September 1825. She first ran on the Stockton and Darlington, coupled to a coach carrying the directors, on the 26th of September, and on the following day, the 27th, worked the grand opening cavalcade from Shildon to Stockton, carrying 400 invited guests. This was the first steam-hauled train on a public railway. Yet, the Stockton and Darlington would not commence a regular steam-worked passenger service until 1833. Locomotion had some serious teething troubles, and this is not surprising. This included the breaking of the cast iron wheels, and in 1828, unfortunately, the boiler exploded, but this may have been the collapse of the flue tube. Whatever, by 1833, Locomotion had been given a new boiler with a single main flue which branched into two smaller return flues, so that the chimney, or perhaps chimneys, were at the same end as the firebox. In 1839, Locomotion is recorded as being carried on 6 cast iron wheels and with a different boiler arrangement again, this time with a simple return flue, a U-shaped boiler flue. In the next year, she was involved in a serious accident and was, quote, much broke. It's not clear whether this accident in 1840 marked the end of her operational career. In 1839, she had been offered for sale, and by 1840 was 15 years old and probably obsolete. The next we hear of Locomotion is when, in 1846, she was loaned to the Pease family to work as a stationary pumping engine at their pit at Howden. Here she remained, pumping water from a coal pit until March 1856, when William Booch, of the Stockton and Darlington's Shildon Works, was ordered to report on her condition with a view to restoration. He wrote that, quote, "The old locomotive number 1 Locomotion was about 9 years ago considerably altered in its working parts to adapt it for pumping water out of a pit at Pease's West Colliery. He estimated the restoration would cost at least £50 less any extras. And as a result of this, Locomotion went on display outside Darlington North Road Station in 1857. Quite how much of the locomotive which went on display dates from 1825, if any of it, is unclear. Over the following years, Locomotion went on her travels, including several visits to the United States and to France. In 1892, she was relocated to Bank Top Station, Darlington, and she celebrated her centenary in grand style in 1925, making copious clouds of smoke from burning rags and being propelled by a petrol engine in the tender. Having passed successively through the ownership of the Stockton and Darlington, the North Eastern Railway, London and North Eastern Railway, and finally British Railways, Locomotion left railway ownership after 150 years in 1974, becoming part of the National Collection, cared for by the Science Museum. In 1975, Locomotion was moved to her present home at North Road Railway Museum in Darlington. At the same time, a full-size working replica of Locomotion in her as-preserved condition was built by the late Mike Sato to take a starring role in the 1975 Grand Cavalcade to mark the 150th anniversary of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. The replica is now on static display at the aptly named Locomotion Museum in Shildon. So those are the basics on Locomotion, the number 1 locomotive of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which opened 195 years ago this month. So come on baby, do the Locomotion. If you have enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe, and see you next time on Rail Story.